That's probably, I mean, the Philippines is pretty heavily Catholic still, yeah?
Yes, very much so.
So, guilt.
It's straight up guilt.
Not to put too fine a points on it, but...
No, but it is.
It's the same in Spain, too. Very, very heavily Catholic, and again, I remember when I was taking Spanish classes, we learned very much so it's similar. If you're gay in Spain, you dress a certain way, you talk a certain way, you act a certain way. There's only a certain kind of behavior you're allowed to adopt in public where you're going to be accepted for being that way.
Yeah.
You need to be publicly identifiable as such.
Yeah.
To exist as such.
That's how it is in the Philippines very much.
Mm-hmm. And that's, it strikes me as being almost ironic that you have San Francisco, like the San Francisco Bay Area, which is kind of like, it's like the Holy Land.
Yeah.
For gays in the United States. It's been awesome for me. You know, I can walk down the street holding my boyfriend's hand without having a glass bottle thrown at my head.
Yeah.
As was the case in Roseville. But, have you seen any people have an easier time from the Philippines identifying as that? Have you witnessed that kind of a...
Yes.
Yeah?
Well, it's different dynamic, because then here... It depends. Like with most, like just the dominant thinking now is that, you know, everyone can be who they want to be, and, you know, that's it. They're, you know, accept it.
So given the nature of what you said, where, you know, people come here and you almost have to be a part of a community in order to survive, especially in the Bay Area, coming from, you know, a poorer country to, generally speaking, like, as the numbers go, like, a lot of Filipinos just get kind of almost like menial work, it would seem like, by the numbers. And so living communally would really kind of help to offset the costs of that. And I mean, in your experience or in your observation, is that kind of like, do you think that's almost like an obstacle to being able to really, I guess, come out? Because you're still really kind of linked to that culture and kind of... So even though you're in the United States, or at least the Bay Area, where it's more acceptable and you can see it around you, is there still like a kind of a limit to how much you're able to express that relational to your community involvement?
I think
What'd you think?
I think because of like the nature of the Bay Area right now, like we can be whatever, right? For folks who I know who have come out who weren't based in the Bay Area, it's still very much not talked about. A lot of them were like you know disowned. A lot of them were you know, still don't have good relationships with families or friends or whoever, but they're, like I said, it's not talked about. Like, even if you do come out, it's like, don't tell anyone.
Yeah.
Right? Or, you know, fine, whatever, but don't show me, don't bring anyone home. You know, it's like that. It's like that. And so, there's a lot of people wanting to come to San Francisco to escape that, you know, persecution of being queer, and so we kind of form our own factions of, like, you know, in my teaching, when I was teaching at the high school, a good number of us were the teachers were queer and not from San Francisco, so we called ourselves the queer corner, and we'd always have our own outings. We're gonna bond as you know, gay Filipinos, because we've never had that before, and so and even like sharing stories, like, yeah, our families are accepting, but at the same time, like, it's always iffy to bring someone home, because then it's like you can't introduce them as your, you know, significant other or whoever. They're always just a friend. This is my friend that I've been bringing home for the past 5 years. This is still my friend, you know. and so it's like, it's just silence. That's what I'm seeing a lot. And then other times the families who and the people who have grown up in the Bay Area and come out, that's the supportive families that I, you know, they come with these amazing stories of, like, yeah, like, it wasn't a thing. And I was like, that's odd to me. Yeah. You know, and to a lot of us who are not from here, it's like no one raised a fuss. Like, you know, one of my friends told his mom, she goes, "Oh, that's good. Can you pass the nail polish?" It was just like, oh, I had chicken for lunch today. It wasn't a deal. And so, you know, I think just living and growing up in the Bay Area as a queer person, like, you kind of get it a little bit easier.
I would imagine.
with at least with family, being more open than the rest of us, like, but there's still that, like, okay, we're gonna be okay with it, but then, don't tell your uncles, don't tell the extended family, we're cool here, but outside of the house. So it's still a little bit of give and take, but we don't have to perform as much as folks in the Philippines do.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have to I don't have to dress masculine for them to know who or what I am.
Yeah, lumberjack sweater, big boots, and baggy
yeah.
jeans.
But it was like, how do you know? And I was like, those questions of like, okay, how do you know? Are you sure? And I was like, yeah, pretty sure. And I'm kind of, it's an interesting case in my family because my older sister is queer too. And so I think by the time they got to me, they're just like, yeah, we've been through this.
Yeah.
So,
saved you a little grief.
A little bit. But it's still like, I bring my girlfriend home and it's still like, oh, is your friend coming? Yeah, she's coming.
That's how my grandmother refers to my boyfriend.
Friend.
Or I would say, hey grandma, this is my boyfriend so and so, and it's like, oh, your friend. It's
yeah.
like, yeah.
Still friend.
A friend.
Yeah. But yeah, I would just say, like, a lot of times I just see that it's not talked about. Even if they've been in committed relationships, there's things happening, still kind of not talked about. And even my girlfriend's cousin who lived in Canada, he's kind of a big he's kind of, I don't want to say A-list, like a gay list A-list, but like he's kind of known in Canada through certain circles as being who he is. And he had this blog about like, oh, I finally came out to my family, and I'm like, you've been out in Canada for like 20 years, like, what do you mean you just came out to my family? And he goes, my family told them. And I'm like, how? I don't understand that. Like, I don't understand how they didn't know. And it's like, no, they knew, but then they still didn't acknowledge it until I told them. Like, even if he had, these blogs, and even if he had, like, these magazines, these articles, these books, he still had to tell them, because then that's when they would believe it. And I'm like, oh, okay, but do we still have to go through this pomp and circumstance of coming out like that? And I mean, isn't it enough to, I'm one of those people that's like, isn't it enough to see me with my girlfriend and understand that? Like, I'm not going to go up to a queer couple and be like, oh my god, are you guys gay? Like,
that happens a lot, though. That does. Are you guys boyfriends? Oh my god, that's so cute.
It's such a weird thing for people. For me, to still see people try to categorize. I don't know. I think that was just weird for me. I was like, you are very much gay. How did they not know? And he goes, no, it's not that. It's just, I had to admit to them. And I'm like...
Yeah, it's like acknowledgement. Like, face-to-face acknowledgement, I guess, is kind of...
Yeah, and so it's still that question of, like, we still have to come out.
So is there like another... I mean, so it sounds like there's kind of like another level of discrimination, really. Like, I mean, what is... It's kind of funny to me. It's like there's so much, so many different filters.
There are.
I guess for how so many filters to get through before you're pure Filipino. I guess is really the sense of it that I've gotten, and I wish there were more, I guess, accounts that I could find about what it is to be gay and Filipino, particularly in the Bay Area, too. Because I can envision a lot of things being difficult with it.
Yeah.
I can envision it being another difficulty, but really there's just not a lot of evidence for it, so it's like...
Yeah. They're books, but they're like, there's maybe like 3.
Yeah.
As opposed to like all those other books that we have. And
like if you had to make like a contributing statement about your experiences... with being gay in Filipino culture specifically, like, what's the overall sense of it?
Oh, that's hard. Most of the accounts is just, you feel constant guilt. And I don't want to say that for everybody, but for, you know, people I've talked to, and even, like, to some extent, like, me, like, there's just been this guilt of, like, you know, not that we're ashamed of being gay, but we're adding this stress to the family, right? Because then the family is just, like, with the family, sometimes it's, like, you know, make sure to keep this quiet, keep this, you know, but not necessarily my family, but, or as much as in my family, but, yeah, it's over, like, overwhelming sense of guilt that you've let them down somehow, and, it's a hard thing to process, like, how are we letting them down, you know?
Do you ever get any kind of, I mean, discrimination for that? In your own experience, like, specifically from people in the Filipino culture? I guess, like, discrimination on the basis of, like, being queer or being gay. I mean, is it kind of its own beast, or is it pretty similar to the kind of general discrimination that people will get?
I think it's a little bit of both. Like, we have very specific, I don't even know how to approach that. It's mostly like...
Try writing your second essay of the semester.
No, I know. Like, this is a thesis right now. But
yeah,
it's oh, God. The discrimination, I would say, it's very much backed because of religion. Whereas, you know, here it's backed as religion too, but, like, people can write it off. I don't know how to explain that, but yeah, like, Catholicism is such a huge thing. Like, there's that, it's just guilt upon guilt, and then, you know.
So is Catholicism pretty present in your family, or pretty present in the Filipino culture here, like outside of the Philippines? Or?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I would. Oh gosh, at some point I would say it's even more, because that's the only thing I can really cling to.
Yeah.
Is like it doesn't change. Like, Catholicism there, Catholicism here, like, same, you know, ultimately the same thing. And so, you know, and church is where you're going to find your friends. Church is where you're going to find people from, you know, the same areas of the Philippines. So if you go to that specific church, you know that there are going to be people who have the same similarities as you. So then they're going to flock to those places, right? And, you know, and as Filipinos grow older, they become more dependent on religion also. Like, my family is rosaries almost every night. Like, not just, I'm gonna go and say it myself. Like, no, it's a production. Like, there's the altar, there's people coming over, there's food, there's prayer for 3 hours.
So that can really limit access to a supportive community if you're really rejected by it, and you come out as gay. And so, I mean, you're not just risking, I guess, you know, family rejection or risking community a sense of guilt. Rejection. You're risking full-blown, like, support network, community rejection.
Yeah. It's tricky. I think it's really tricky. And then...
That sounds like way more tricky than I would ever want to have to go through. I was really lucky with my coming out process, I think. Because it was like, dad says, hey, your mom thinks you're gay. Yeah? Oh, okay. That was like the extent of it, you know, for me. So it's like, it's interesting getting a perspective on that for me. I mean...
Yeah. I think it's just more so we're so afraid, because, like, you know, and then you do hear the stories of, like, you know, people coming out in the 90s, coming out in the early 2000s even, of, like, being beaten, and that still happens. But, like, of being beaten and being kicked out of their house.
It happened in, I think, Sacramento when I was going to college in Sacramento. Like, a bunch of, again, like, Orthodox Christian, Ukrainian men beat a gay man almost to death, I think in Sacramento or Carmichael area, and it was really shocking. Because, I mean, that was just when I was actually starting to get, like, active in the community and stuff like that at that point, and actually, like, meeting other people and discussing, okay, what are the problems, what needs to be done, like, it's
still like that. Like, we still hear those stories, and so, like, with the younger generation, they don't, you know, they have that I don't give a fuck attitude. We're going to do whatever we want to do. And so, I see it there with them not being ashamed, not having that guilt, and I'm like, you guys are amazing. Like, I would have never done that in junior high. You know, I would have never brought a girlfriend home when I was a freshman. Like, you guys are fearless. Me, I was like, fuck my life, dude.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it's like, it's really relative.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, you can only, I mean, you can say it's fearless, but they might not have something to be afraid of. In that sense, too. I mean, like, so maybe it's not so much courage as that's just they don't have that kind of rejection from their community. They have a different community, or they're not as tied down to that for their support network.
Yeah.
You know, I'd imagine it'd be a lot riskier moving from place to place, having, like, you know, one or a few vestiges of community that you're familiar with, you know, and having that be your handhold, and you're not going to do anything that's going to involve you slipping from it.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, if you grow up here, you go to school here, it's got to be a little different.
Oh yeah, yeah. So the only way I really can explain it is it just becomes this culture of silence. Like, you don't talk about it. Like, the person who was in Canada for 20 years. He's like, we just never talked about it, but it was known. Like, it needed to be verbalized, right? But it was also, it just comes down to, like, we're just not going to talk. We don't talk. There are issues we don't talk about in the family, and that is one of them.
Well, that drives me nuts. I'm way too chatty to not talk about everything.
So, I mean, there's still, like, there's still cultures of silence within my home, too. It's like, I've been with my girlfriend for 5.5 years. My sister's been with hers for, like, 15. And it's like, it's still like these, we're not going to talk, but we are. You know, and it's very different. I have no idea to explain it. But, the siblings we talk about all the time. But the parents, just like, oh, is your friend coming? Okay. And then that's it. And then you just treat them.
I gotta wonder how, like, especially with, have you seen any, this is an interesting question, this is fascinating to me. Have you seen any impact from the recent Pope? Like, the latest Pope, has there been any kind of an effect on everything we're talking about with, like, being gay in Filipino culture? He's got a lot more,
he's very much more open.
Very much more, like, accepting and almost saying Catholics everywhere need to be this. You need to be more accepting. You need to be more educated about this. Like, have you seen any ripples from that?
Not personally.
Really?
I haven't been in that church culture and able to see it, but I do see it in churches in the Bay Area. I don't necessarily see it in churches in the middle of California, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So in the Bay Area, churches in Berkeley, churches everywhere else have, like, the gay Catholic peer group or whatever. And they get together and talk about the Bible and being gay and all these things. And so, and there's no guilt associated with it, which I think is really cool. But then other places, it's still like, here's a petition to, stop gay marriages or, make them legal again or something. And it's weird. And it's just because I'm not really familiar with this new Pope either. The guy before was...
Ratzinger was interesting, yeah.
He was a little bit scary. So I was like, okay. And so, like, the more that I read about this Pope and how open it is, I have hope.
Yeah.
And I have faith that things are going to change, hopefully. But, I think with the younger generation, like, we definitely cling to that idea of, like, well, the Pope is fine with it. Why isn't there for everyone else?
You think especially, like, with a culture pretty heavily influenced by Catholicism, that it would...
Yeah.
Maybe, I guess it remains to be seen. I mean, he's only been the Pope for, what, a year?
Yeah,
maybe?
A year. So he's fairly short time, right? And so he's trying to do some really radical things within the church. And so I think people are just trying to keep up with that. And I also think, like, because of, like, all the scandal and all that stuff that's happening within the church, people are also trying to stay away from churches. So it's very interesting dynamic that's happening with Catholicism, and I'm waiting to see how it does affect and how it does ripple within the culture within the Philippines
Mm-hmm.
and here. I know that the churches, when I went back home to visit, and had to go to church with my family, like, it was very different.
Mm-hmm.
Just, it felt more, like there was more lights, it was more open, there's a lot more singing, and to me it felt really not like Catholic Mass at all. It felt kind of...
Yeah, which is, I've always been... I don't think I've actually ever been to a Catholic ceremony in any way, shape, or form, but I've heard the picture that you get in your head, at least that I got, has always been kind of a somber affair.
Yeah, and so there were, there was a lot of singing, there was people, like, starting to dance, and I've only seen that at, like, friends' churches who are, like, evangelical or, like, Baptist and out in the halls. And,
what was the one? I think I went to a Pentecostal thing once, and they were just...
Oh, yeah.
It was like a little celebration under the roof the entire time. I was like, I was far out of my element, but it was very different from some of the other kind of things that friends have brought me along to, different churches and stuff, and it's... Yeah.
It's the same thing for me, coming from Catholic church and then going to my friends, like, churches that did not feel like church. I got really confused. And then when I went back, I was like, this doesn't feel like Catholic church. And and at some point I was, like, really angry. Because I was like, why isn't church normal? Why do they have to change it? Why does it need to change? It was fine the way it was. And and then I was like, no, it did need to change. Why? I hated going to church the way it was. Why am I hating it now in its new form? It's very weird. I was, like, so, like, almost to the point of offended. I was like, why are they raising their hands during the song? Put your hands down. Why is this person, like, calling the Holy Spirit? Those are things that we're not familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's also a little bit of it, is, like, these changes that are happening within church, and people are very resistant to it.
Mm-hmm.
Me, who's, like, in no way, shape, or form connected to a church, was very angry that, all of a sudden we were holding hands during prayer. Like, we don't hold hands. This is not how church is, And so, those little things. And then for them to change it systematically is going to be a huge thing. So I think, like, Filipinos are still trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
Like, church is changing, and it's different, And even within the rosary groups that my parents are part of, it was changing, and my mom was very upset. And was like, I'm going to, like, step down from the board, and I was like, why? What is changing, Mom? And so, I think it's just that, like, people are very, especially Filipinos, are stuck in their ways, and for it to be challenged can be very...
Well, especially when it's, like, a link to what's normal for you, too, like that. It'd be very hard, just with human nature being what it is, to sit there and say, well, this is my one link to what I feel like is home, and now it's changing on me.
Oh, yeah.
And this has been, like, my rock. Like, even if it's changing for the better, the very act of change can be pretty traumatic, so I can see that.
Oh, yeah. And I think with, like, with legislation, like, having to go around queer rights and gay rights and all that stuff, I think people are just, it's, like, sexuality's in their face now, as opposed to, like, that culture of silence that was there, like, don't talk about it. It's like, well, we have to now, because you're voting for things, and it's very prevalent in TV in a different way than it is in the Philippines. It's not about performance, it's about this person can be gay.
But authenticity, I guess.
Authenticity, yeah. And so, I don't know how, like, if they handled it in the Philippines, because trying to handle it here is just, it's all over the place.
Yeah. So what have you really taken away from, like, getting to be a part of the Filipino community here? Like, what kind of thoughts do you have regarding becoming a part of the Filipino community? And I guess, what would you like to do in the Filipino? Like, what are your goals? Like, what would you like to see come about as a result of your involvement in the Filipino community here?
I think just having them educated about the history of, like, what's been going on. Because I know when I started taking those things, I started feeling valuable at some point, you know, and you learn about, like, oh, we are important, you know. You learn about these very distinct cultures and places in classes, but you don't learn about yourself. And that happens to a lot of people, just in general. Like, when it doesn't pertain to yourself, you get disinterested or don't care. You know, like, why would I have to go to this class? It has nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think, like, being part of the community up here, like, I learned by learning, you know, learning about the history, learning about policy, learning about people, I was more open to learn about myself through my family. And I think that's the one thing that I mostly take away is, like, it was a gateway for me to understand my family and to even talk to my family, begin talking to my family, right? Finally asking, like, what was it like? You know, what is the Philippines like? How did you grow up? What were the things that were going on? And I think it made me closer to my parents and, you know, ultimately to my brothers and sisters once we started talking of not being so isolated as the American child. You know, and I think that's the thing, the community, like, even if you feel like you can't fit into your community, and I feel like that too, like, sometimes I can't fit into the Filipino community, but I'm going to show up.
Yeah.
And there's still, you know, like a need or a connection that I have. And that need and connection connected me to other people in other ways. And so that's how I felt, is like that, you know, because I came up...
So kind of like fostering that for other people too, because it is rewarding.
Yeah, and I always say, like, I have my family in the Bay. You know, I have and they are my family, and in some ways more so my family than my real family was at that point. You know, I didn't have any connection to my real family in, like, the early, like, 20, I don't know how old I was, but I just didn't associate with them. And I definitely took them for granted. And then coming up here, I realized how important they were and how I needed that connection and that network back to them, even if, you know, we always fought. At least they were still there.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think for me, like, then I understood, like, that idea that Filipinos are close. Because I always raged against that. I was like, Filipinos aren't close. Well, my family's not close. But then I realized, like, no, I was the one who was pushing them away.
Yeah.
And so that's part of it, is, like, you find family either within your community, and you find family with your own family. That's how I felt. So, what else did you ask? Sorry.
It was pretty open-ended. I mean, is just anything else you really wanted to add or you think could be worth mentioning, I guess, just in the context of everything we've been talking about.
It just comes down to, like, if you want to find out more, you just have to research. There's not as many books as we have, you know, like, there's still a ton of research that is not there. Especially how you were saying, like, there's not that much.
It's just anecdotal stuff. Like, there's not a lot of data. There's not a lot of, and it's like, I guess it's difficult too, because, you know, my interest in it would be, I guess the proper word would be queer studies, you know, but there's overlap. There's territorial, like, you have, like, the queer studies people, and then, like, the Filipino studies people would probably have a hard time collaborating or taking credit for the research for it too, but I think it'd be, especially, you have the Bay Area, which is such a huge home to, you know, Filipinos, particularly Daly City, Colma area, and the Bay Area is also a major refuge for gay Americans. You know, it's teeming with, you know, gay culture, and I hate the word gay culture personally, but, you know, it is. For whatever on earth it is, it's teeming with it. It's absolutely rife with it. And to think that there's so little data on that intersection, which there has to be.
That's the thing, though, is, like, I think you touched on it exactly, is, like, there's this idea of, like, territory, and, like, how do we dip into both, right?
Like, and territorialism. Territorialism.
There's that, and there's also this idea of authenticity. Like, if you're Filipino, but you're looking at queer, you gotta be gay. And then it's, like, because then everyone around is just like, well, how are you, who is not queer, going to represent us, right? And then the same thing over here is, like, how are you, as Filipino, not going to represent us? And I think that's where a bunch of us, with, you know, my circle of friends, we're trying to do that work, but at the same time it's really hard because people either are reluctant to talk, or like don't just cannot see like the importance, or just don't feel like that needs to be an issue that needs to be written about, right? Because then we're past that, we're post-racial, we're post all of this, all that bullshit. And it's like, is it important? And it's like, well, yeah.
Yeah. Even if it's only at an individual level, I mean, it has to be.
Yeah, and so I think with a lot of us who are trying to do these queer culture, these queer culture things, these Filipino, these intersections of just even getting numbers down, like how many of us are out there, it becomes really territorial, and then at some point it becomes really tedious.
Yeah, it does seem like such a fascinating field too, because like we talk a lot about identity, where Filipinos in the United States and overseas and even in the Philippines are concerned, and it's such a nebulous word. Yeah. It can mean so many different things to other people that you start talking about, not only having an identity as a gay individual, but then you try to fit that context into a gay Filipino, and there's not a lot. I mean, it's Spartan, the amount of anecdotal evidence there even is, just for people's individual stories. But it would be really neat to have more data and see how exactly that affects people's ability to identify.
I mean,
what's the value of identity to you? Oof. If you had to say, what is the value of identity? Or what's the value of being able to identify as anything, really?
I think for me, it's just people have been labeling me my whole life. And then, it's a way to claim yourself, And I think ownership of yourself is, one of the first ways to end up loving yourself, and then loving yourself gives you confidence in all these things, and it's it's a process, it's a struggle that I still continue to struggle with, this idea of self-love. But I think like having a firm grasp on who you are, who you want to become, or even just having words to call yourself, because I didn't have words to call myself growing up.
So if you had to put down on paper, like, what were your 3 biggest obstacles to identifying? Like, what would they be?
One of them is ethnicity. Like, I didn't know what I was. I knew I was Filipino, but I didn't know what Filipino was because no one was showing me that. So, like, I would claim Chinese. I would do all these things, anything but Filipino. I was island, I was Hawaiian, I was, Laotian, because my friend was Laotian, and I knew more about her than I knew more about my family. So that was, like, the biggest one growing up, was, like, what the hell is Filipino? Knowledge, definitely. Yeah. To sexuality, just growing up, I had no idea what was happening. I knew who I liked immediately, and
but did that ever interfere with your ability to say, I'm Filipina? Or did it ever occur to you that you couldn't be both, or really be assertive about identifying as both?
It took me a long time to even identify as queer, right? And then, multifaceted later, like, because I'm bisexual, and even coming out as bisexual within the queer community is this huge.
Oh, it's pretty, it's pretty messy.
But then even I have, like, some bi discrimination sometimes. Yeah. So, and that's weird as a bisexual, is having bi discrimination.
Yeah, it happens. Yeah, totally. I even read an article on it as recently as last month, and it's just interesting that there's this whole idea of you're almost viewed as a fake by both sides. So you get discriminated against by both sides.
So it's very weird to come out as that in the queer culture, and then and just having, like, even talking about sexuality or sex or anything in the Filipino is very hush-hush, right? Yeah. Like, you don't talk about...
That's probably a lot of the Catholic thing, too.
Yeah, you don't talk about these things. You don't talk about, like, birth control and all that stuff. Yeah. It just doesn't happen. And so, even like, asking what the hell sex was a big thing. So that was another thing, is, like, I couldn't even... I had no one to go to in terms of, like, my emotional feelings towards, you know, people, or sexual feelings towards people. And then I had no one to go to in terms of, like, medical, just in general, of, like, what is happening to my body as a girl, right? I couldn't you know, those things weren't talked about. So that was just another obstacle. Just like, all right, I'm a girl, and I like both girls and boys. Like, what's happening, you know? And there's at points I still struggle, but I knew very much, like, my gender-wise, I was female.
Yeah.
But sexuality, you know, I was just like, whatever. And there was, you know, when I was little, I'd make comments about, like, how pretty girls were or certain things. They're like, oh, don't say that out loud. You know? Or they would make fun of me, and they're like, oh, I think she's going to grow up to be a little Thibaut, you know, or Thibaut or whatever. And they're like, don't say that, blah, blah. And it's just, it's again, that culture of silence. And so I silenced myself a lot of the time. And is, you know, and double that within the culture, and then double that with, like, a farming community that was very homophobic. You know?
Yeah, Central California is not known for its accepting nature, so, yeah.
Like, I remember in high school, the lesbian couple got detention because they kissed in the quad. When, you know, the straight couples are having sex in, like, the trees.
Yeah.
Right, so it's just, I was still very, like, okay, I'm not gonna say anything, I'm gonna get in trouble. Right? From both sides.
Yeah.
So, I think that was it for me. It's just those two is, like, having the words, like, even bisexuality still is a weird thing.
It seems like such an oddly clinical word. Like, you can just, like, it's weird to say that even at this point, like, just saying, I'm gay.
Yeah.
You know, that means it's more all-encompassing now than it used to be, because before it was just, you know...
Yeah. But even
and then you have the word, like, you know, queer, that's sort of being reclaimed. You know, because when I was a little kid, that was a huge insult. You know, massive insult. Now it's...
People still see that as insult. But, like, at this point, like, that's the only word that I choose to identify myself. Because, you know, if I say gay, they're like, you're not a guy. I'm not really, you know, I'm not really a lesbian.
Like, it's almost like...
So...
It's better to take a word that even has, like, these... I guess that's just how sterile and clinical the word bisexual sounds. Because people are more willing to start reclaiming and using an uncomfortable word that might have been wrong word, like, that they've been pelted with as an insult, rather than use something so surgical sounding, I guess, for lack of a better word. It just seems like a really...
Oh, yeah.
I hated that word. I really have hated that word my entire life. Even if it's relevant, even if it's something you identify with as self, which word you choose to identify with says a lot about. Yeah,
you know, and like I said, it comes down to this language, having these words to identify yourself. Like, you know, once I was able to understand what Filipino is, I was like, okay, but that's not who I am because I'm in the States. So then coming up here and learning the word Pinay and how that's very connected to Filipinos in America, Filipinos in California, that's how I identify myself. So I'm a queer Pinay. And even having those words was such a huge thing of identity. And, like, I can claim not only myself, but then claim these political histories with those two words. And align myself with those political histories. So I think, you know, being able to identify yourself, being able to have the words is very powerful, because then not only are you identifying yourself, but you're identifying your lineage of struggle. That sounds weird. But your lineage, your history of, like, how you got to that point. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Anything else you wanted to add?
That's it.
Alrighty.
I think so.
I think I've only got like a minute left before this thing's going to shut down the video anyways.
Okay.
So.
Wow, that was really long. But thank you. That was awesome.
Well, thank you for your time. And bye.